But anyway, so yeah, to introduce our topic for today, you and I, Michael, we know each other through certain kinds of professional contacts that are fairly close knit and last over the course of years. There's obviously a lot of valuable to professional networking and so on, but it's becoming increasingly obvious that just listening to the media is a way to drive yourself crazy. And how do you keep yourself sane in a world where everything that you're being bombarded with from every side is so slanted, narrowly designed to manipulate you that it starts to unmoor you from reality? And one of the things that's been proposed, and which I definitely agree with, is that we need smaller social circles, not huge social networks where we barely know anybody. We're thousands of friends, but we don't know anybody. And, or just even necessarily purely narrow coworkers and things like that, but professional associations, but more tight knit, more brothers in arms kind of relationships with a small number of people who we understand in a sense are a part of our extended family. And the way I've always defined extended family is they're the people who have your back and who know that you've got their back and the people you can turn to. And, but in fact, these are kind of relationships that because we're so physically distanced from each other, because we have so much electronic intermediation, that we need to actively cultivate. And we actually need to understand what the best practices are for cultivating that kind of long-term, tight-knit support network for each other. And maybe you'd like to make a couple opening comments about what I just said, Mike, and maybe touch on even on Dunbar's number and how that kind of relates, because I know that's something you've brought up before.
Yeah, absolutely. There's sort of one thing I want to actually say that is ahead of the conversation about the number of sources that you have. And that is the thing that makes our conversations highly relevant for me, Wolf, is that you and I both have a very strong sense of personal identity. So you mentioned how if you follow the media, you go crazy because you get unmoored from reality. The reason why I believe we can both be friends and we have less susceptibility to this unboring is because you and I have a very good sense of who we are. We don't agree on everything, right? And we are strong enough in our own positions that we can disagree in a formal way, right? So we have, hey, this is what I think. Here's all the evidence. So I believe this is something else. Here's all my evidence. And then we have a phase where we can get to it. And I think that anyone who is on this trajectory of, I want to learn how to sense make my environment, the first place they have to start is with themselves. You must have an understanding of who you are, is that you want in order to get it. And I think that presupposes the conversation around the number of connections that you have. But I will say about Dunbar's number, which is roughly 150, is that human beings have a very difficult time maintaining a high amount of state. So like an understanding of somebody's emotional context, their belief context for more than 150 people in their lives. So this is inclusive of all your family relationships and all the relationships that really matter to you online, et cetera. It's not going to be really more than 150. You're going to be able to understand somebody durably through time. And I think that once you see this, then you can really do that process of cutting out people who don't make the 150 cut. So anyway, that's my sort of opening remarks.
Yeah.
Self first.
Yeah. Let's just see, in a way, what you're describing is how many stories you can follow. Because when you talk about emotional context, like when I think about my mom, I know kind of what's going on in her life, not all the details, but I know where she sits emotionally at this point in her life and what her hopes, dreams, and aspirations are and all that. And she's pretty up there in years. But when I resume my conversation with her, we can pick up where we left off. And I think what you're saying is that Dunbar's number suggests that the number of people you can possibly do that with is just limited. You might be able to use augmentation like exobrain software or whatever to keep track of the details of people's lives, but you don't really viscerally relate to a lot of people. When you see people on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or whatever who have thousands or even millions of followers, we get into the nature and the level of parasocial relationships where people have kind of the illusion of they may understand something about the emotional context of people who follow, but it's to a certain extent also manufactured. Whereas the real kind of authentic relationships we can have is very limited. And that's partly due to evolution. And since it's also partly just due to the constraints of time and space, how many people can we successfully interact with? And then choosing that means that because of that limitation, we have to start making conscious choices about who those people are. Unfortunately, we're living in a society where a lot of people are being told that they have to choose sides, where if you're not with us, you're against us. If you're canceled, then I can't have any kind of relationship with you. Of course, of the last few years, I've been canceled by a few friends who I thought would stick by me, even if we disagreed. And yet they've been pushed into a situation where they feel like associating with me and somebody who believes what I believe in certain ways is somehow neglecting their duty to be a good person. And so they leave. That makes me sad, but in a sense, they've selected themselves out. But how do we select who the people are whose stories we're really going to follow on a personal level and who can actually help us develop our own story? Is that kind of accurately capturing what you're saying?
Yes. And I have very specific recommendations for people on how to set these networks up. You and I are part of several of these networks. I have a lot of effort and energy developing networks that I overlap most using some of these principles. Like the first one
Yes.
is values alignment, which
Okay.
is, I have an understanding about who I am and what I'm about. And so I want to be around other people first, have an understanding of who they are and who they're about. And so one of the things that you mentioned was people canceling their relationship with their own life because of beliefs they hold. I choose first and foremost not to be around people who engage in that sort of behavior, because while I can understand the positive case for it, it's not something that appeals to me, because I am not terrified, but very paranoid about missing something extremely obvious that a heterodox contrarian person like yourself, Wolf, or like me or whatever would have.
Mhm.
And so if I feel like if we have the ability to say, look, that's where your circle is, and this is where my circle is, and they all interact a little bit, and we can maintain a sense of decorum between us, that is very important for me. It's the first place of values alignment that I look at, which is this person able to separate the content of what I'm saying from the context.
Are they capable of understanding that as a complex being, I'm not one thing, and that to reduce me to one thing and storm off because I'm not what you want me to be in that area is basically making people into caricatures. And you can't really have people who see you as a caricature in that tight inner circle of 150 or even fewer people who are your support group in life. Fortunately, I believe that a lot of people just disqualify themselves because they behave in that way and they stomp off. And that leaves you with one more open slot. And so I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. It's sad. It's tragic. That's where our society's headed.
Yeah. But the things that I believe, I do the same thing. So I do not engage with people who are playboys, perpetual play. If you don't have a desire to have a family and to contribute over generations to our society, I really don't spend a lot of time with you. And it's not because I don't like you or whatever. It's that I don't feel like we have high values alignment. And so I don't see what the benefit is of me getting. And that's an example of it where it's not negative, but it's where I cancel.
Sure.
So I think we all do this. Like, I don't candidly, like, I don't really deal with people who make a sports fan of their entire life. You
Right.
don't have any interest in being around them, where they're every time we meet up, they're talking about the latest game that I watch. And it's because I'm just not interested in the same thing. So I do think this idea of being exclusive with what it is that you permit is really where the value comes in. So anyway, that was the only modification I wanted to make. It's not like I'm rejecting you because I don't like you. It's like we don't necessarily share the same value.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. You make a fair point that somebody cancels me because they learn about a political view I hold or whatever. And they feel like, well, I just can't support that and we can't be friends. It's okay. You get to choose your friends. And that is them exercising their choice. And I might have seen other value in our relationship that we could have held, but they have elevated that to the point where it becomes so overriding. Now, in terms of what do I consider to be overriding? Like you said, people who, for example, have extremely, if they're personality disorders, they have extremely negative, pessimistic views on life, on themselves, or self-deprecating talk is a huge red flag for me when people deprecate themselves. Yeah, we all have flaws and failures and so on, but people who constantly remind you and remind themselves of things that maybe aren't even real, I back away slow. But when I'm choosing the people I want to be close with, I want to look at these people as, in some ways, exemplars of the kind of person I want to be. And so one of the things I look for is and I think you've alluded to it, but not by this name, is what Napoleon Hill would have called definiteness of purpose, which he contrasts to what he calls drifting. People who are just drifting through life, being pushed by the winds of culture and a bucket of crabs, their existing circumstances, and not seeing beyond those things. I just feel just no attraction towards whatsoever. The people I feel an attraction towards and the people who I want to have near me are also people I can learn from and who I can say, when I'm not feeling so great in a given morning, I can say, what would Michael Gimmerin say or do in this kind of situation, or anybody else who I admire that way, who I feel like has that definiteness of purpose.
Yes. So that's the first thing is I want people who are having a definiteness of, that's great. I think the next thing is we need, in order for us to be effective at sense making, when we have a non-technical conversation, we need to have an understood agreement on what the definitions for the words that we're using are. So when you and I are communicating about reality, there are certain words that we use. The most easy to point towards are men and women, but you and I have very firm understanding of the totality of those words and where they overlap and where they don't. And if you, men and women is a silly and absurd example, although our society has fallen to the point where we can't define what a woman is at a societal level. That is what I think is really important for psychological safety, because when you and I are discussing a more complex topic in our private networks, I don't want to have an argument with you about what a woman is or what it means to be someone who follows a particular ideology.
Yeah.
Can this person recognize the difference between if the talking head says that somebody's a fascist, but they're not actually a fascist? I don't want people who believe that they're a fascist in my network. We can have a conversation about whether the talking head is correct, but I don't want them to just de novo believe things that they are told and that those definitions radically drift from mine to the point where it's very difficult to have any conversation whatsoever because all we're doing is talking about the definition.
Yep.
And there are specific policy implementations of this as well. So for example, for many years, when you compare infant mortality rates between Europe and the United States, the definition for what infant mortality rate was different enough that the entire observed difference between infant mortality rates between Europe and the United States was captured by the difference in the definition between those two areas. And I don't want to have anything that is like that, because then what happens is you get really far down the conversation. Somebody says, oh, when I meant democracy, I didn't mean like actual democracy. I meant the Republican system. And you're like, what the hell? It's not helpful. So also when you're choosing people, they need to be people that have similar definitions. And this is why it's so important for many of us who are unable to form these relationships online. Wolf and I have been making friends, people online for 30 freaking years. In my case, I don't know how long for Wolf older because you're older, but like I made friends on Usenet, for crying out loud. So I've been doing this for a very long time, but for many people who haven't, they need friends that they see in person.
Yes.
Because when you're in person with somebody or you're in the same church or whatever, then there's a vocabulary that you share. There's a context of life that you share that allows you to actually have a conversation with people. And I think one of the things that people really miss when they try to do sense making today is that they project their definitions of very basic things in their mind in reality onto other people that don't share those same understandings of reality. And then they go crazy because they're trying to make sense of what somebody who has fundamentally different definitions says is, right? So like, for example, when I think about America, there is a complex set of relationships that emerge in my brain that don't include that America is fundamentally bad because it was founded on slavery or all these things. There are other people who have a completely different understanding. And when you're developing a sense-making group, like the group of people that you're going to be with to understand the world, you really have to ask yourself, like, are the conversations I'm having about the best way to go from A to B? Or am I just having conversations about what is A? And you really will avoid conversations where you're constantly fighting about what is A, because that is how you go crazy.
Yeah, you touched on that in a previous conversation. I thought that was a really valuable point, but definitely worth bringing up again. I see Owen has his hand up. Let me just respond really briefly, or at least moderate something I said earlier. I talked about definiteness of purpose. I appreciate people who have definiteness of purpose. Sometimes that purpose isn't complete non-alignment with my own purposes. Like, for example, somebody might feel very strongly that they are part of Antifa and want to bring down all of capitalist society and by undermining it. Well, that would be definiteness of purpose, but their other values are so out of alignment with mine that that kind of makes that worthless in my opinion. And I would exclude them from my inner circle, even if they're scathingly intelligent and so on. We just can't agree on greater purposes. So we can't agree on how to guide each other through life. But so, like you said, it's a confluence of values and sense making tools. Like, how do we agree on what reality is? What do these fundamental definitions mean? Definitely want to find people who share those definitions, but for example, maybe share more fundamental mental things. Like, do we even agree there is an objective reality out there to be discovered and that we can, at least to some extent, understand it? Anyway, I want to give Owen a chance to speak. But what's on your mind, Owen?
Yeah, I think I just had a question based on what I'm hearing. When I think of a lot of the networks that naturally form in life, you obviously have your family that you can't really choose. You have a limited amount of choice in terms of your work relationships because you can choose when to work, but you can't really choose who else is employed there. The same is true with a religious organization if you join a church. But also each of those networks, and even if you extend that to voluntary friend networks, whether it's school based or after that, there's usually some kind of purpose around those things, some sort of shared activities or some reason why you have that network. And I think what I'm missing in the conversation so far here is just, it sounds like you're talking about a different kind of network, but I'm not sure if I've really heard like, what is the purpose of that network? Or is there a specific definition around this network that you're saying is the most important social network?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's definitely something that needs clarification because for me, it's not about any necessarily one group of people, because in a sense, we're as individuals, our lives, like you said, have overlap in a number of different spaces in our work, in our profession at large, in our biological family, in our other friendships that maybe we have bowling buddies. We have a reason to be with them because we bowl or whatever. And then maybe there are some people who we feel like add to our life of the mind, and maybe our just ability to sense make in the world. And those are all reasons to be together. We were born together as siblings or parents and children or some other reasons there. So one way I've looked at this is that obviously we don't get to choose our family of origin. We're born into that. And then, but as we get older, our family of origin tends to dissipate, ages, dies, moves away, whatever, has their own kids. And we often tend to become more and more separated. And I think that in our society, which again, we're very alienated from our personal in-person relationships, which is something I want to talk about more too. You mentioned, Michael, is seeing people face to face, that we need to increasingly take it upon ourselves to find our family of choice. And that's not necessarily one group, but it could be, but it's usually probably going to be a very small number of groups, maybe two or three at the most, that we feel keep our feet on the ground in life. And maybe that's a church. Maybe it's, say, a men's or women's support group. Maybe it's, in my case, one of my families of choice is my motorcycle club. I'm vice president of a local motorcycle club here. And yeah, we ride bikes together. But more than that, we're there for each other. We're local to each other. And if somebody needs help, we're right there. It doesn't matter who or when. All have each other on a private chat group. We talk about life. We get together in person on a regular basis to celebrate things, to commemorate things, and to go on rides. So it's much more than just a bunch of people who like motorcycles. And it's also something that has a barrier to entry. You don't just, I don't know how many people who ever listen to this know anything about motorcycle clubs, but a real MC, a real motorcycle club. And please don't think about Sons of Anarchy, because even though it got some things right, it got a lot wrong. It's something that it's not an open group to join. You actually have to hang out, then you prospect, and then everybody has to vote you in. It has to be unanimous. In other words, you have to show yourself worthy of being part of the group. You have to be admitted. And the idea that groups should have barriers to entry, have a membrane, which to get in, you have to pass certain tests. You have to be a certain kind of person. I think that's incredibly important. That doesn't happen with our families of origin, but it certainly can and should happen with our families of choice. I don't know if that helps clarify anything directly about your question, Owen, but the idea being these can take a number of different forms, but they have to be consciously chosen. I think that's the main point I was trying to get at. Did that address anything for you, Owen?
I think my question is, are you trying to describe a certain type of network that's for a certain purpose? Like I heard this term sense making a couple times. Are you talking about having a sense making network? I see in the tweet that you set out for the space, you talked about a micro tribe and a mastermind, and those things might be somewhat similar, but maybe different. So I'm just looking for more of the definition of what is this type of group that you're saying is the most important
Yeah.
social network.
If I were to come up with an umbrella term for everything I was suggesting in the invitation to this space, I would say we're talking about intimate social networks, not wide reaching, highly networked effect groups, but people who, but having a certain number of people around you who are themselves nodes into a much larger space, people who you feel like you can turn to for certain broad categories of things. There are certain things with that I know I could go to Michael and ask you about if because I know Michael, and that people can come to me to and ask me about because they know me. And so it's not even just a matter of necessarily doing favors for each other, but it's a matter of extending your reach in the world in ways that matter. And maybe at a church, it's about people who you feel like you can celebrate life's highs and lows with, and you have to give if you want to receive from it. But that would be a kind of intimate social network. And so building, and as I said, I think this is the most important kind of social network, but it's also one of the ones that's becoming more and more undermined and corrupted and neglected in our society. And so I wanted to reaffirm that this is super important and that we all need to be thinking about this, and we all need to be exchanging ideas about how to do it right, because if you're not careful, you get sucked into a cult that's doing it wrong. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think I was just looking for clarification on, is this a defined type of group that is going to be doing a specific type of activities? In a church, I would tend to think primarily we're worshiping together, we're doing Bible study, things like that. If I'm in a work setting, I might have a network there, but that's primarily all focused around those work activities. I think from what I recall of Napoleon Hill's book, when he talks about masterminds, that's typically more about
Business.
fostering success in business. So I'm curious as to, is this a different set of activities
Yeah,
or
not
purpose?
necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily different. I think that all those things can overlap. I'm talking about, for example, like I said, I think all these things come under the heading of intimate social networks, whether they are a mastermind or whether they are a church community or whether they are a motorcycle club, or just as long as people know you as you and know you as an individual and can give you and can really look at your life story as it is right now and talk to you about it, and you can talk to them about their life stories, then I would say you're in that kind of group. Beyond that, I would say, even if most of what you talk about is business or even sports or whatever, but if you can talk to the other people in the group as them and they can talk to you as you, then I think we're in the space I'm talking about here. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Michael, did you have any thoughts on this?
Nope. I like where you're headed. So I'm along for the ride.
Okay. So, yeah. So I guess what I'd like to turn to is, what do we consider to be a set of kind of best practices for this? Obviously, I do think sometimes you're drawn together for a purpose of some kind. And like I said, Michael and I know each other for a group that's not really a professional group. It's more of a group of creative technologists who share a sense of the possibilities of technology and generally share an optimistic viewpoint. That might be painting a bit too broadly, but yeah, but we're drawn together as people who get to speak on each other's level, and we're honored to be in each other's presence. Over the course of years, we get to know at least a subset of these people as individuals, and sometimes even come to regard them as extended family members. But the fact is, we're there for a higher purpose. There's been a few times in my life when I walked into a situation and been on there a couple minutes and thought to myself, these are my people. And it hasn't happened very often, two or three times in my life. But I feel like finding that kind of group where you feel like suddenly you're at home, even though you don't maybe know many people's names yet. I think that's super important, an experience for everybody to seek out. If you don't have that in your life, I think you need to seek it out. And so I guess what I'd like to discuss is how you look for those kinds of things, where you find them, how you recognize them. Because of course, again, there are religious and other cults that they follow the kind of typical kind of programming where they love bomb you. They help, they offer solutions to your life's difficulties. They may even have some valid tools that you can work with. They demand more and more from you, and then they start to isolate you from the outside world. That would be a failure of that mechanism, in my opinion. That would be drawing you under false pretenses, because I don't think these groups should disconnect you from the rest of the world. You should still have the freedom to choose where your other intimate connections lie, but not all groups permit that. I'm just curious, maybe if anybody, Michael or Owen or whatever, has a sense of either situations in your life where you feel like you found your people and what that kind of entailed, or maybe principles you apply when thinking about how to find such groups.
I think so. There's a couple of things that come to mind right away. The first one is that it's really important when I'm joining a new group or evaluating a new person from my group that I try to align what they're saying with the impact of what they're saying. So if the level of effort and attention that I have to spend in order to verify what they're saying is low, then it's fine for me to believe in it, right? And I can try it, and then it goes along with what I'm doing, and it's great. And I always want to try and measure those two things up, right? Like impact and level of effort. They need to be equivalent, right? So in the case of aliens, that's a very bold claim. And so you're going to need a lot of evidence. And that's how I feel about that on the first side. On the second side, I don't think that you should belong to a group that doesn't make it really easy for you to leave. So part of my problem with a lot of institutions today is it's very difficult to opt out. It's almost impossible in the United States to opt out of the FDA. So, for example, if I wanted drugs from Japan that were approved or not approved under the Japanese FDA, it's actually quite difficult to get those. And so in the US, you basically have to leave the US or you have to leave the US system in order to do that. And of course, it's even more difficult with, say, taxes if I disagree with the government. And so when I'm looking at a group that I want to join, I want it to have the opposite framing, which is it's very difficult for me to join the group, but it's very easy for me to leave. And when I think about internet groups, when we say it's difficult, I don't mean there's a really hardcore initiation. What I mean is that in order for me to become seen as an authentic leader in that group, I have to participate and I have to achieve things that are hard. And through doing that, I can find other people who've done that. And so then there's a higher affinity at that level in the group. But it's easy for anyone to say, you know what, this isn't for me anymore, and I'm out. And anytime that I get the sense that it's very difficult to leave a group, I don't even want to join that group because I don't want, it's like how I always refused to be an ally when I was in school, not because I care, not because I am bigoted or don't care about people who aren't the same as me I don't like the idea that the label ally could be redefined away from me by somebody who's not me. And that now all of a sudden I'm beholden to a set of standards that I didn't agree to in the beginning. And so I don't like groups like that. And I think that's how you really identify a cult is, are they asking you to change your information environment in such a way that you aren't able to get new information, you're not able to leave the cult, or are they removing your other relationships that are outside of that organization? And if they don't do those two things, then I don't see them as a cult.
Owen, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to your question about how have I selected that sort of thing or looked for those people. And I think one aspect is a lot of my career has been relatively demanding career that takes a lot of my time and puts me with my work colleagues for most of my waking hours a lot of the time. And so naturally that meant that most of my network was within the company I was working with. And so when I would select who I wanted to be closest to, it was usually based on, this might overlap with the shared values piece, but I would look for people that I could learn from, like someone who was a lot more skilled in something that I thought was a good quality or trait, whether it was they were very persuasive or they were very skilled technically, or they knew something much more in depth that I wanted to learn, that I would then gravitate and try to spend more time with those people and work with them more, because that would mean I'd be able to absorb a lot of that knowledge and skill over time, which I think I did. And so that I think was a successful aspect of my process. But another thing I learned as a lesson over time is that I switched companies a couple of times. And even though it was a very similar company, as soon as I left the company, my entire network disappeared.
Yes.
Because that was the context of those relationships. So I realized that all of those relationships were temporary, right? Because they were all based on that shared context of that work relationship. And so it struck me that I might want to have relationships that are outside of that, that have another basis, because even though a lot of those prior relationships at that prior company, they would still probably today consider me friends, we just would never spend time together. And I felt, okay, I could put a whole lot of effort and try and continue some of these relationships on a personal level. It would be like starting over, even though it was the same relationship, because you'd have to find another reason to spend time together and probably talk about completely different things, because whether it's because they're confidential or just because you don't want to talk about work when you're not at work, it would be like a completely different relationship. So I think the context is an important aspect to that, to say, if you want a long, durable relationship, you probably want to have it outside of some other context that might end up being temporary, whether that's where you live or whether that's a church you belong to or a work relationship, things like that, that those can put a constraint on some of those relationships.
Yeah, the way I think about that is that for any relationship to last, whether it's with a life partner or people you happen to meet at work who you might share some interest with, is for the relationship to have many deep roots. If your relationship is a single shallow root, like which company you're working for at the time, you might be spend a lot of time with certain people and really become fond of them, and they may become fond of you. But as soon as you move on, that relationship is essentially gone because it only had one shallow root. If you want to find a life partner who you're going to be with your whole life and be madly in love with, you've got to recognize that you share many deep roots of values and goals and ways of thinking about the world that mean that if any one of them is shaken, or if events come along that shake the relationship, and it will, when you move on from a job, that shakes that relationship. Well, if it's weakly anchored, it's blowing away. That relationship is gone. But if it's strongly and deeply anchored, and for example, like in a church, the church I grew up in went through a schism where it had its founder died, and the person who was appointed to be a successor changed a lot of their doctrines. I'm not religious now at all. Living through something like that, where some people are trying to hold what they think is the founder's vision versus the people he appointed to be his successors, which is very different, is a huge shakeup for people. And the relationships from that time that survived, whether, for example, only a few of mine ever survived. First of all, because I left religion, but second of all, because you go to that schism, people factionalized. And when that happens, you learn who your real friends are, because they're the ones you share a lot in common with. And that is completely apart from that ostensible reason you're together, like you share the same faith. And when I'm talking about these kinds of intimate social networks that we should be seeking out, yeah, they might be a mastermind, or they might be, and part of it is they know you personally and you know them personally, and you can give that kind of customized counseling, advice, support, whatever. But ideally, I think that the most important ones at the core of that core need to be ones where you're sharing your lives on a fairly intimate level, and because those are the ones that will survive. And that's why, for example, like I consider my motorcycle club to be that. Now, if I moved away, it might, because there are chapters everywhere, it might actually be something where we might grow apart. So in a sense, that might be, I'm trying to be a little bit self-critical here, that might be weaker and shallower than I'd like it to be in terms of the people I love as my MC family members. But it's like, right now, I know that they're there for me. And even if I moved away, we'd still have fairly strong bonds that last for years. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And then another question I had is the relation or the effect of gender on this. Because at least
Mm.
as I see it, men relate to men in a different way than women relate to women as friends, and might have a very different type of relationship or talk about different types of things. And men and women, I think, relate to each other differently than they would to a same sex friendship. How do you see that playing into the selection of these types of groups?
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, again, just using the same touchstone I've been using for a little bit here is a motorcycle club. A lot of motorcycle clubs emerged out of post-World War II, men coming out of the military and missing the military kind of regimentation and wanting that kind of brotherhood camaraderie, and then forming these groups where they engaged in paramilitary dress and road information and stuff like that. And they didn't admit women. Most clubs who carry the badge MC still don't admit women, but some do. Mine does. And I consider them to be my sisters. So in many ways, that kind of social relationship does that exclude other kinds of kind of male female relationships? No, generally speaking, that's not why we're there. And if anybody thinks that's why they're there, then they're there for the wrong reasons. But in terms of men and women having their own spaces, yeah, I think that's something that, that I think a healthy view of our species dimorphism is that in general, men also need the support of other men, and women need the support of other women. There's always going to be educations and so on. And there's always going to be groups of misfit toys out there that I'm also part of in certain ways. And I think I would encourage that, because sometimes sex is not what matters at all. What matters is other values. And the world should be big enough to have all these things and have them overlap and meet in one person to a certain extent. But yeah, I definitely agree that men need spaces, women need spaces, and there are certain kinds of ways that men need to congregate and teach each other how to be men that women really don't have much to add to that. And women need to congregate and teach each other how to be women in a way that men don't have much to add. I would personally generally support that view. That just even the mere fact of being a man or wanting to be a better man is a reason to seek out other men who you are intimate with on that level as man to man.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Michael, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's not been my experience that it's groups that I've seen that are predominantly women tend to be context first, and groups that I've seen that are predominantly men tend to be content first.
Hmm.
And I don't think that those things are easy to reconcile. And so what I end up seeing for groups where there's more than 10 or 15% women is those groups shift over to being contexts first.
Unpack that different. How are you distinguishing context from content
Yeah.
in the
So
two
I
brands?
think in a male dominated space, and I understand not everyone's always in male dominated spaces, but in a male's dominated space, there is a competence hierarchy that forms for whatever the task is at hand for the space, for the reason for the space to exist. So like, for example, if a bunch of guys show up together to rebuild a trail, they will immediately form a hierarchy of, okay, I'm going to do this and you're going to do that. Great. I'm going to do this thing over here. One guy will just emerge as the person who's organizing this effort, and everyone will become very comfortable very quickly based on their perceived status among everybody else in what they should be doing. And
And that's what you're calling content or
content based. Yes. The communication, when you break out the communication that's being done between all the participants, it's very much of the form of the content of whatever is being discussed is the first and most interesting thing. And I think there's a lot of guys who are really uncomfortable to be around, and they say things that are not appropriate in mixed company, and that people who are very concerned with how others perceive them become very upset by. But you sort of see this, right? And like men will like play with each other in terms of the comments that they'll make, teasing, et cetera, et cetera. And that is how these hierarchies are both formed and then maintain order, even in the face of pretty grim circumstances. And if you've ever had to go through something really difficult and stressful and traumatic with men, you'll see that even in the worst of times, there's joking and all this kind of thing, at least in a normally bonded male group. When I have seen women get together, the context that the group exists in tends to be the format of what is. So for example, there will be rules around how people communicate. There'll be rules around what is okay and what is not okay to discuss, the context, if you will, of whatever the work is going to be about. And particularly men who are seen as disruptive are very quickly sidelined, regardless of the value of their potential contributions. And so you see that people leaning away in that case. And from a performance basis, there's not really such thing as a group of women that takes on an uncertain challenge and is successful. But there's plenty of examples throughout all of human history of a group of men who take on an uncertain challenge and are successful. And I think it has to do with this difference between the regularity and the uncertainty of the work, and therefore the content versus the context of the communication. So so like from a sense making perspective, because fundamentally it's about uncertainty, I don't get a lot of signal personally as a guy from groups of women that are trying to sense make, because it seems to me that those groups are more interested in figuring out what is the socially acceptable form of behavior for everybody, as opposed to what is actually happening and what will happen, about making predictions about the future. So
would you say that men more naturally form hierarchies and women more naturally kind of form kind of matrix kinds of organizations? And that's part of what is contributing to the kind of style you're talking about?
yeah, so my experience in the first order is that men tend to create competence hierarchies very quickly. Doesn't matter what it is, one always emerges. And then women tend to take on the competence hierarchy of the strongest man in their life. It tends to be my experience. And so you see this a lot in like military contexts where all of the wives get together, and the hierarchy of the way the women interact perfectly reflects the rank hierarchy of their husband.
By the way, we have several people in this chat, and we appear to be a fairly mixed group. I'd love for anybody who has thoughts about this, of any gender or inclination, to raise their hand and give us the thoughts. Obviously, Michael and I are two men talking about this stuff, and I don't wish to exclude anybody from the conversation who feels like they have something to add. So please feel free to raise your hand and chime in. And but so would you say that, Michael, this suggests that the kind of organizations that men should seek out, at least that obviously we have maybe our larger context relationships, like our family of origin, which are obviously mixed, or maybe church groups, which are obviously mixed in terms of gender, but that men should be seeking out kind of competence hierarchy based men's groups to help make sense of the world. Again, not that I'm presuming to offer universal advice to women, but what would that suggest to how a thinking woman should think about seeking out kinds of groups that would suit her and would help her be more grounded in the world in the ways we're talking about.
Yeah, I tend to give the same advice to both men and women here, which is that you should seek out information which gives you the best opportunity to thrive in the world for whatever it is that you're trying to do. In terms of, have I seen a group of women come together and sense make an uncertain situation and get to a solution that is effective for them? No, I have not. Unfortunately not. I also have I teach a class on sense making. I have tried to teach it to women. It does not work. Whatever it is that I'm teaching has not functionally worked in a group of one-on-one, totally possible. But if I'm trying to teach like 4 or 5 ladies at the same time, it does not work. And I'm not entirely sure on why this is. And I don't know. I talk to my wife about this all the time because obviously women need to understand as well, like what's going on in reality. But the idea that like in the sense making groups that I've been in with men who are very effective at figuring out what the truth is and like sifting out all the bullshit very quickly. There's no comparison. It has to be the way the communication style is. There's no other thing. I don't really understand why that is. And I think my experience is limited for on the women's side. And I've tried really hard to try and adapt the content, but it hasn't gone.
Yep. Heather J has requested to speak. What would you like to add?
Uh, well, I'm a woman, and that most recent comment caught my attention because women they're really challenging to deal with, just saying. And from my perspective, it's got to be a woman that's wise and that pays attention and that isn't caught up in self and materialism and such. I cannot deal with women like that. I would rather be in a men's group. But I know there are women I'm so thankful for Twitter Spaces because I found some really good women that speak with intellect. And it's not because they have degrees, it's just because they use their God given gifts and talents and have a bigger perspective. So that's my female input into what y'all are currently talking about. I hope it's relevant. I missed most of this space, but just thought I'd chime in
Yeah, well,
there.
thank you very much, Heather. Yeah, I can't tell you how many times in my life I've known a woman very well, my own wife included, but at some point in the conversation, she interjects, "Huh, women." But of course, whereas most of the time I don't hear men say, "Huh, men."
And yay, women, we give life. We
Mhm.
bring so much to the table. And I would love to know where we just went off path as
Mm.
far as where did we get so caught up in all of this bullshit? Pardon my
Yeah,
French.
no, that's fine. Yeah, well, I mean, and part of the purpose of this conversation we're having right now, of course, this is a series of conversations that Michael Gimmerman and I and whoever shows up are having about making sense of the world, thinking better. And in this case, specifically finding your tribe, finding your support group, finding the people who make the most difference, can make the most different, positive difference in your life. And to a certain extent, men need men and women need women, and we need each other. And I think I want to honor all of that. Women are amazing. And I'm so grateful for the woman in my life. And yet we are very different and we have very different needs and different styles of interaction. Owen, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to chime in with my own thoughts on this. That one of the aspects that I understand, at least intellectually, I'm not a woman, so I can't say I understand that intuitively, but I think women tend to do a lot more emotional labor, which in my mind, what that means is they think a lot about what other people think of them and how other people are treating each other. And is it fair? Is everyone being supported? How is everyone feeling? And I think to me, that might be somewhat in conflict with the goal of a sense making group. Like the goal of a sense making group is a focused task, right? Like you're looking at a particular issue, even if it's an uncertain one, and saying we need to come to a solution or we need to come to a conclusion. We need to have the best possible answer. And I think that is somewhat of a more task that's more suited to men. I'm not saying that women can't do it. They certainly can, but I think when they do it, they're probably taking on a little bit more of their masculine side.
Mhm.
Everyone might have a masculine and a feminine side, but I think men, because they don't have as much of that emotional labor going on, that they just are concerned about that. So when this competency hierarchy forms, they just roll with it, right? Yeah, that's just what happens. And they don't worry about, does that person feel bad or is that person feeling insulted, or was that person treated unfairly, or should that person actually be higher than they are in the hierarchy? And so I think to me, that might be one of the aspects that's in the way here,
Yep.
because I think it is just the nature, I think, of women, that they tend to care a lot more and spend a lot more effort thinking about and trying to process and even trying to problem solve the emotional aspect of what's going on, as opposed to just the content of the task and how do we get to the best solution. And they don't want to put aside all the feelings, right?
Yeah. If you pay attention to psychologists like Jordan Peterson, who's done a lot of work with personality types and so on, women tend to be way more empathic than men. And for my own part, I rely on my wife to tell me what's going on around me socially, because I'm pretty much blind to a lot of it. But it makes my life much richer and much better that she's there just to point out these kinds of things going on around me. Women also tend to be higher in neuroticism, which means they are more concerned about things that could go wrong in life. And one of the things that could go wrong is other people feeling bad or feeling hurt. These things play off of each other. Men tend to be less concerned about hurting people's feelings and more concerned about making it to the other side of the prairie and making the sacrifices that are necessary, making those hard decisions in the face of uncertainty. And these are ways that we complement each other. And again, finding groups of people who can support you adequately in life, to a certain extent, acknowledging who you are at your core. And you may not be in the center of the bell curve. You may not be the archetypal man or woman, but knowing who you are, knowing what you want, and then finding other people who have similar goals, aspirations, and ways of supporting you and acknowledging who you are, I think is key. And I think that's part of what we started out this conversation with you saying, Michael. We're coming close to the end. Here we go, an hour, and we will be doing this again next week. Michael and I have agreed to get to at least 10 of these conversations. They're all going to be up on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@BewareOfWolf podcast. And so I hope you'll go there and check out our previous conversations. This one will eventually arrive as well. And Michael, do you want to say a little bit more about who you are, where you can be found, and so on before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I thank you all for coming to this space. I think it's a very interesting conversation around how to cultivate a group that allows you to discern what's going on in the environment. And I do think that there are challenges for us depending on where we come from. And of course, whether or not we are a man or woman, to get into the last part about how to do this effectively. And so I am very interested in exploring these challenges and how to set up these groups and how to help people figure out what works best for them. And that's the focus of my Twitter account, which you can find at Michael Gimmerin. And that's what I like to talk about, is how do we get better at sifting this signal from noise in the areas that matter for us.
Yeah. Would anybody else like to chime in with a last minute comment here? I really appreciate everybody's taking the time to try out and listen to this. And I'm, like I say, Michael and I have been doing these conversations both because we hope they're going to be useful and relevant to you right now, but also for posterity. We hope that these conversations will continue to live on in our AI avatars in the future. But seriously, we want this conversation to be valuable to you. So if you have suggestions, please either DM me or tweet at me later. Tell me what you think might be good topics to address around sense making, better thinking, critical thinking, not critical theory, critical thinking, and provide any feedback. We really appreciate all the comments we get. And so I guess we'll wrap it up there if nobody else has anything else they want to say. But thank you again, Michael. I'm really getting a lot out of these conversations that we're having.
Likewise. Thank you, Wolf.
Okay. Everybody have a good week. And
Bye.
yeah, you're very welcome, Heather. Thank you. And we'll see, hopefully, all of you, and invite your friends. We'll be doing it next Tuesday at 1 p.m.